All right, there we go. All right, so today we're going to talk about how to create a pollinator garden. But why are we talking about this? Why is this such an important topic these days? So you probably have heard that there is a decline in pollinators. You might have heard that there's a decline in insect populations around the world. And this is really important to us humans for a lot of reasons. It's important to the planet for a lot of reasons. But if we're going to be selfish about it, which is a good way to get started in understanding, is understanding what's closest to you, is a lot of the crops that we eat, our plants and our products that we use and fabrics that we use are insect pollinated or animal pollinated, not always insects, which we'll talk about. It's actually about 80% of those things that we produce. And the picture on the left that you can see here actually shows a picture of a bee visiting a citrus blossom. So citrus is among one of those crops. But there's a lot of crops. And so I certainly don't expect you to read all these because that would be silly. But these are some common insect pollinated crops and certainly not an exhaustive list. But some of my favorites are on this list. Take note of coffee and chocolate. Okay, I wouldn't be here talking to you right now without coffee for sure. The sugar I put in my coffee, the sugar cane is insect pollinated. Even the dairy products, so the cows aren't pollinated, but the food they eat is. So it's really important. That cup of coffee wouldn't be happening. So the world would be a terribly bland and tasteless place if it weren't for insects. So that's why it's important to us as humans. It's important to the planet because insects not only pollinate, but they provide a lot of other services. A really great example that's easy for folks to connect to is insects are an enormous source of food for birds. And so when we have an insect decline, it's going to result in bird decline, and then other animals and plants that rely on those birds then decline. So we're all part of that cycle. If you want to know more about the decline of bees and other pollinators, the National Park Service has a great site, and the link is here. Don't feel like you have to write this down or do a screen grab because I gave this presentation to Jane and she is going to share it out to all of you. That way you'll be able to click on the links yourself. But since we have a few of us here, I was wondering if anybody wants to take a stab at or a venture at why we have bees and pollinators declining right now. Anybody want to take a couple of guesses at what's happening to the insects? You could just open your mic and say it or throw in the chat box. Where did my chat box go?
People don't like hives of bees around their house, so they just kill the whole hive.
Yep. Fear, right? Fear. I've got 2 people in the chat box who wrote pesticides. Those are some really good reasons. Any other guesses? I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead. There's a couple other reasons that we didn't touch on that are, stuck. Hang on, just give me a second. There we go. When I had the chat box up, it wouldn't let me change slides. So we talked about pesticides. Habitat loss is kind of related to that fear. People think they don't want the insects close to their homes. But it can also be things like the picture on the right where we're just plowing down entire parts of the world to build homes for ourselves. And as you'll notice in that picture on the right, we took down everything, right? We took down all the trees, and you can see in the distance the finished homes, they didn't put a whole lot of trees back. So those are some problems. Climate change is a problem. There's a picture on the left. Wildfires, as you guys are hearing in the news, are rampant in, well, not just our country, in the world. We're seeing them in Greece, in Canada, and all over, and that destroys habitat. Parasites and diseases are attacking them. The honeybees that we rely on for our crops have a disease that's been affecting them, as does the monarch butterfly, has a deadly disease that has been affecting them. And the other one that I didn't mention yet, the non-native species, we have a lot of plants, whether they're actually invasive exotic plants or just exotic plants. And the only reason they're bad is we plant a lot of them. We buy them at garden centers, we plant them here, and a lot of times we plant them here on purpose, because we bring them here and no bugs want to eat them. And we think that's great as gardeners, right? Nobody's not eating my plant looks pretty. And the reason why is our native bugs didn't evolve with those plants. So they don't know the plant is tasty, They don't know to visit the flower. They don't know to eat the leaves. And so the more non-native plants we plant, the less we provide for the insects. So all of these things, it's like death by 1,000 cuts. We're affecting the insects and pollinators in a number of ways. But I have good news, because it's not all doom and gloom, right? It's not all fires burning and monarch butterflies dying, because there are things that we can do ourselves all over the world where we can actually provide habitat back for many of these critters. And the other really good news is that, you know, a lot of these insects, their habitat range as an individual might be rather small, something you could actually create a meaningful habitat for in a residential yard. And so I feel like there's a lot of hope out there, and it gives us something positive that we could focus on. And we need that right now so much. That goes back to the wellness part of this. We need something positive to focus on to get us through this. So the next question you may be asking yourself, what is a pollinator? So you guys are probably familiar mostly with the European honeybees, the ones that most people keep for like hives and honey that farmers use for their crops to increase pollination in their crops. Those are actually not from this country. They're not native to the United States, but they are actually from Europe. They're still very useful and not considered harmful or invasive. There's all kinds of other bees. There's over 315 species of native bees just in Florida, not even including the European honeybee. And you don't have to keep hives for most of them. Most of them are solitary bees that live alone in a hole in the ground or in a hollow stem in your garden, for example. There's other ones too, like flies and wasps and beetles and just about every other insect, like butterflies. Other animals like bats and even birds can be pollinators. And in fact, you could be a pollinator if you wanted to. The picture on the top right actually shows somebody artificially pollinating, where you take the male flower and apply it to the female flower as if you were an insect carrying the pollen from one plant to the other, which is kind of fun and a super cool science experiment. But a lot of us crazy garden people do that. Particularly, I have a lot of gardeners who garden in their pool cages, in those screened enclosures of their pool cages. And as you can imagine, there's not a lot of pollinators in there because they purposely have the screen up to keep the bugs away from their play space. And so then oftentimes you have to pollinate yourself, which is kind of cool. But you too could be a pollinator. I'm gonna chat. The chat box isn't staying up for me. Hang on one second. So I'm just double checking. Okay. Pardon the interruption. So if you do have questions, feel free to throw them in there and hopefully it'll pop up and let me know. But maybe Jane could let me know if I miss it too. Pollination, and we won't go obviously real deep into this. We all went to school. I'm sure we talked about this multiple times over the years in school. But basically, just to remind everybody of exactly what goes on in pollination, is we have an insect, usually an insect, that takes the pollen grains that come from the male parts of the flower. In the case of the bee, like the example shown here, as the bee is gathering nectar that the flower provides, then the pollen just gets stuck all over the bee. So as it moves then to the next flower, that pollen that got stuck to it happens to land on the female parts of the flower it lands on next, and the next flower and the next flower. And it's rather accidental in that sense. But the plant has evolved to attract the insect because the insect provides a benefit. So you think, well, why would a plant bother to do all that? How did they know to do all that? Well, that's evolution. That takes time. But the plants evolve and they grow different colors and shapes and everything to attract insects in order just to get them to provide this service. And that way they can spread their genetic material far and wide. Since plants can't get up and walk around, they've got to be able to spread their genetic diversity. And they do this largely through insects and birds and crazy plant people like myself inside of screened enclosures. And they can also pollinate via the wind. So a lot of plants also actually are wind pollinated, and they don't need the help of insects at all. And these are the ones that give us allergies for the most part, because the things that are wind pollinated have teeny tiny pollen that just catches up in the air in a wind gust. If you've ever been outside here in the springtime, and seeing the big clouds of yellow and green coming off the oak trees and even the pine trees. Those are wind pollinated. They don't need bugs to pollinate. And so that's the difference. Usually the insect pollinated plants, their pollen grains are bigger and heavier, and they won't move by the wind. And so that's why they need insects to move them. So that's kind of the two main ways, 3 if you count, people with crazy ideas, that plants get pollinated. Any questions about that so far? If not, I'm going to cruise on to the next step. I got to tell you all the background so you know why you should plant a pollinator garden. It's important, right? A fun fact, this is cool. Little drink break there. So bees are attracted to certain colors, and that would include blues and purples and violets and yellow and white, mostly. Butterflies are attracted to colors like the warm colors, like red and yellow and orange and pink and even purple. So if you're going to plant your garden and thinking about attracting one or the other, you would focus on those color groups. But what we're going to talk about later is it's even better if you can incorporate all the colors or as many as possible. Or if you don't have as much space, you look at the colors that they both like yellow and purple come to the top of the list in terms of colors that would appeal to both. Just something to keep in mind. All right, so now we're going to get to the nitty-gritty of how do you actually create this in your space. And to create a pollinator garden, you're going to follow the 5 Bs, okay? But of course, we're not just going to attract bees. This is for all kinds of pollinators. But you saw we have European honeybees and 315 species of bees. So a lot of them will be bees. And before we go on, I want to just remind everybody, because we came up, right? People are often afraid of bees. They're afraid of being stung. They're afraid of being near the hive. European honeybees do have a hive and they do protect it. So if you were to come upon one and surprise them, you might get stung, right? But generally speaking, when bees, the native and the European ones, are out nectaring, when they're out looking for nectar and pollinating, they're pretty busy. They're usually pretty far from the hive, the honeybees that have a hive, and they're usually not in that protective mode. And so typically we get stung accidentally. We run into a bee, we step on a bee. This is how it normally happens. If you plant a pollinator garden, don't be afraid of attracting bees, because they're going to be very busy in your garden. They're not going to be out looking to protect the hive, unless you knew you had a hive right there. The 300 or so native bees that we have are mostly solitary bees. They live alone. They don't have a hive to protect, and they don't have that territorial behavior. They're very, very unlikely to sting. So just keep that in mind. The fear factor should not be high for this, because it's not likely to add danger to your landscape in any way. So these are our 5 Bs that we're going to follow to attract pollinators. And we're going to dive into each one of them. Be sunny and open, be diverse, be colorful, be welcoming, and be gentle. So let's talk about how do we do all of those things. The first one, be sunny and open, is really about picking the right place for your pollinator garden. And the best place, if you have it, is a place that's got a lot of sunshine. Flowering plants thrive in the sun for the most part, and even plants that tolerate a little bit of shade are going to flower more profusely in more sun. And so if you can find a sunny spot, that's what you should focus on. Now, some of us have a lot of trees, which is a fantastic problem to have. And more shade. And so you can accomplish some of these things in a shadier spot, but you're just going to want to, it's going to be harder to pick as many flowering plants that'll flower as much in the shade. So you're going to have to make an extra effort to plant things that are shade tolerant and also flower. Just keep in mind that it's going to get, the more shady it gets, the more challenging that's going to be. So really focus on the sun. The other thing is make sure that you've got access to water. Well, we are definitely not encouraging people to use a lot of water in the landscape. We do the opposite, as Melissa knows, because she works with us here at Extension in the Florida Friendly Landscaping Group. We're trying to get people to use less water in their landscape. But when we plant new plants need some extra love at the beginning. So they're going to need regular water, depending on how big they are, for probably at least a few weeks. It's a great time to plant now because we get free water all the time from the rain. So that's really helpful, but make sure you have water nearby. So near a hose bib, near a irrigation system, just to increase the chance that your garden succeeds. But the idea also, and we're going to talk about how to pick the plants, is to pick plants that are very drought tolerant and suited to your site, so that after you get these things well established, you don't have to waste a bunch of water. So just to make that clear. The next thing that's really important is, most likely in your garden, if you have this spot picked out, or when you have this spot picked out, there's probably going to be something else growing there. Maybe it's just turf grass, maybe it's a patch of weeds, maybe it's maybe it's some other flowers or shrubs, but you're going to want to make sure to remove everything you can before planting a new garden like this. Clear all those weeds, pull up as much of the roots as you can, and think about putting down a barrier to keep the weeds and stuff from growing back. A lot of the landscape fabric barriers out there, they don't necessarily last that long. They say they do, but they don't. And many of them have a lot of plastic in them, which persists in the landscape pretty much forever. Even though it breaks down into itty bitty pieces, it's still there forever. So I'm a big proponent, especially in a garden like this, of using layers of cardboard as a barrier. So you pull out all the weeds, you remove all the plant material, and then lay down a couple layers of cardboard, and you can either put soil on top of that to plant, or you can just cut holes through the cardboard where you want to plant your plants. And so you can plant right through that cardboard. And the cardboard is going to break down, right? It's not going to last forever, and that's okay. Once you put it down, you also can throw the mulch over it, because otherwise your neighbors are going to wonder why you have a weird cardboard garden. So you definitely want to put that down and cover it with soil or mulch. And but it'll give your plants that you want to grow the opportunity to get well established before the weeds try and take over. That doesn't mean they won't, but this is really just an extra step you could take. Honestly, anytime you plant a new garden, you're going to be having to stay on top of the water and the weeds until your desired plants kind of fill in a bit. Another thing that I added here was for location, is I gave you all bonus points for visibility to humans. Okay, that's you and your neighbors. Does anyone want to venture a guess as to why you get bonus points for that? That other little picture down below the garden is a clue. That sign. So I don't see anybody guessing. 2 reasons. Number one, the wellness aspect that we're all here for. If you can see the garden from anywhere you normally sit, your patio, your living room window, your kitchen window, then you're going to receive, extra wellness, because there have been studies. I've got a link about this later. There's studies that link even just a view of nature to increase wellness and well-being. So that's good. The other reason is if it's visible to neighbors, and especially if you go as far as getting it certified as a pollinator habitat or a butterfly habitat or a wildlife habitat, as there's a number of certifications, then your neighbors will learn from your garden. So you'll actually be helping us to spread the news of how we can help. Those are the 2 reasons. There might be more. Those are my 2 reasons. That leads us to the next one, be diverse. So here's where it's important to plant a variety of plants, not just one, not just 2, but as many as you have space for, in all different heights and flower shapes and sizes, because each of these insects is shaped different, can reach different flower parts. Some of them need really teeny tiny flowers to be able to reach because they're teeny tiny, and others can get inside of big flowers. Or maybe a great example would be hummingbirds. They have that long beak so they can access nectar in deep tubular flowers. If a butterfly came up on one of those tubular flowers, depending on the butterfly, they wouldn't necessarily be able to reach as far down the tube. And a bee certainly would never have a hope of getting down to the bottom of that tube unless it was a little bit. So think about all different sizes. Blooms for all the seasons is very important. So if you want to see pollinators year round, you've got to make sure to provide flowers year round. That's pretty easy in the spring and the fall and the summer, but even here in Florida, it's a little more challenging in the winter. Do your best, and I'll give you some tools here for plant selection so you can look at that. But just try to put together something all year round. And I use this for lots of garden uses, but if you have an old calendar laying around, and I probably gave this tip to the veggie garden folks, an old calendar from last year, and you're like, well, this is no good, I'll recycle it. It's great for gardening because you can flip through and you can write down what blooms in the different months. And if you write down a flower for every month, at least one flower that's going to bloom in every month, some will overlap, of course, right? Then you know you're going to have blooms all year round. And so it's just a nice tool. And then you can recycle it later after you've done all your garden planning. So focus on getting different things throughout the year, because some of our insects are seasonal and they're only around in the summer, but we do have some pollinators who are active year round here in Florida. So that's something to think about too. The other one is plant as many native plants as you can. And that's because of what I mentioned earlier. Our native insects evolved with the native plants here. They know what they're looking for. They provide the nutrition for those insects. The flowers are the right shapes for those insects to reach all the parts they need to reach and the nectar they need to eat. And so it's important to get as many native plants as you can. Doesn't mean they all have to be native. There's plenty of non-native pollinator-friendly plants to be had. But I really like to focus on this because a lot of the insects they just look for these, and it's a signpost. They look for certain native plants. It will be more challenging to find. If you go to big box stores, for sure you will find fewer native plants. As long as we've been working on them, there always just seems to not be enough of those. But there are a couple of native nurseries in the area that specialize in native plants. So seek them out, especially, and see what they have. And this is super important for anyone out there who is wondering about how to help the monarchs. People ask us a lot of questions about milkweed. And unfortunately, the easiest milkweed to grow around here is tropical milkweed, which is becoming invasive. And also it grows year round. And you're thinking, well, what's wrong with that, Theresa? Okay, so it would be good, except we have populations of monarchs here that are supposed to migrate. They're supposed to leave. We're not supposed to have them here all year round. And when they stay all year round, that one of those diseases, remember I mentioned there's some diseases affecting monarchs and bees. That disease persists on these plants that live here year round. Then the monarchs stay and then they get sick. And so our native milkweeds, all of them, they are 21 or 22, I think it's 21, native milkweeds here in Florida, all of them are annual. They go away in the wintertime, basically. So they bloom in the spring and then they kind of die out in the fall and then they come back. So if you had tropical milkweed, and I'm not saying you should go get any, but if you had it and you felt bad about digging it up and trying to replace it, they recommend cutting it down to the ground in the fall to mimic the way that our native milkweeds grow here in Florida. So that would be a midterm solution, right? But whenever you can, especially with milkweed, try to find the natives. And they aren't that easy to find. I will commiserate with folks. But they do come to the local nurseries, not the big box stores, but the local nurseries will get them. And when they get orders of them, they sell out fast usually because there's a huge need for them. You guys can email me more questions about that later. But the other thing I want to mention is we don't want hybrids with crazy flower shapes or like double flowers. And this picture on the right is the perfect example. These are camellias, which you can grow in this area, but they're a little finicky here. But this just shows you some camellias. And the top left is a single camellia. That is how one layer of petals, and you can see how open the flower parts with the pollen grains are in the middle. See that? If you're a bee landing there, you can get right in there and reach all the nectar. You're going to get covered in pollen before you go to the next flower. But as we move to the right, where it says semi-double, and then they have all these cute names for the forms and double, triple flowers, as we get further down to the right and the bottom, what happens to all of those floral parts that have the pollen grains? Can we even see them? Not by the end. Imagine if you're a bee. There's nectar in there somewhere, but can I get to it? And even if I can get to it, am I going to rub up against pollen grains and provide pollination services? Probably not. And so while these are lovely flowers, right? And there's nothing wrong with having some hybrids or double flowers in your landscape if you're fond of them. If you're looking to incorporate more plants to encourage pollinators, this won't do it. And so it'll take up precious space in your garden. I don't know about y'all, but in Pinellas County, most of us have smaller landscapes, smaller gardens. And so unless you had enough room for this, I would skip those. All right, so that is how we're going to be diverse. Now, this is the page y'all are going to want most of all later from this presentation. These are some really helpful sources for plant selection. And some of them are focused on pollinators specifically. Some are just really cool plant selection tools. And I'll tell you a little bit about each one of these. The one top and center is the Florida Friendly Plant Finder. It's an app and it's free. It is designed for your phone or your tablet. That's what the picture there is showing, but you can use it on your computer if you want to. It doesn't look as slick on the computer as it does on your phone, but it's certainly there. And you can put in where you live by your zip code, how sunny or shady it is, what kind of plant, a tree, a shrub, a ground cover. So you can enter a number of requirements for the plant you want, and then it will supply a list. It'll say, oh, then you can choose from these 17 plants. Or if you put in a whole lot of things, the more you add, the smaller your plant list gets. It might say, well, these 3 plants might work for your site. So that's a super cool tool that is from the Florida Friendly program, and it's really focused on Florida plants, which that's what we need here. The other Florida focused one is the one on the left over here, the Florida Native Plant Society with the little palm frond logo. Very similar tool that they put together of just native plants. So the main difference between the two is the Florida Friendly one from the University of Florida includes natives and non-natives. As long as they're not invasive and harmful, they could be included on that list. Whereas the Native Plant Society one is only going to result in native plants. And so if you're really looking, if you only have room for 3 new plants and you need to make sure they're native for whatever reason, then you'd probably save a little time by going to that one because you don't have to weed through as many plants, right? I'm always looking for a way to save time here. The next one down, I guess we're going backwards clockwise here, is the Xerces Society, that crazy word there with the X logo. They have all kinds of their website for the Xerces Society. They have all kinds of insect and pollinator information. And they made a list of plants. This is a PDF that this links to. They made a list for every state of pollinator friendly plants for your state. And so that's the link to the one for Florida. Only thing I would caution you on that one is we're basically like South Florida. Most of us are in zone 10. So since it's a statewide list, pay attention to the plants. They may have some plants on there that would only do well in like North Florida or the Florida Keys. So it's drilled down to Florida, but we want to focus on our zone. Whereas the other 2 ones we've mentioned, you can actually click on Pinellas County or put in your zip code and get very specific info. This one is a statewide one, so just cautioning you on that. And then the final one on the bottom right is from the National Wildlife Federation. They have a really cool site, and that's a little screen grab you see there where it says, find native plants, find butterflies, and my list. So on this site, you can actually either search by native plants that are good for your site, or you can search by butterfly that you might have in your area or attract, and then it will tell you what kind of plants to plant to bring those butterflies in. And then you can save them into a list of your own. They just have a way to, that's what the My List is for. So these are going to help you drill down to those levels of plant selection. But I will also tell you that that's what we're here for at Extension. So people sometimes ask, well, tell me the 10 things I should plant in my landscape. And I don't do that because I don't know what kind of soil you have in particular, or how much sun you have, what is the climate, how much water do you have available. So I hate giving you a one size fits all list. Rather, I'd like to give you some tools to use. And then I'm here if you guys want to email or call or ask questions, with more specific. So don't think that I'm leaving you only with these tools, but these are really cool tools, and all in one spot. You'll have this later. Okay, so the next B is to be colorful. We talked about on our fun facts how certain bees and butterflies like certain colors. So it's really important to incorporate as many colors as you can. It's also important to plant in large masses of color. Anyone want to take a guess at why that would be important? If there's anybody in the chat here. No guesses why masses of color might be good? I mean, as humans, it's appealing to our eye from a design standpoint, but that's not the only reason. The real reason is that a lot of these insects that you are hopefully attracting, it takes them a lot of energy to fly across a garden, across a neighborhood, back to the hive if they're honeybees, back to their home if they're solitary bees. So it takes a lot of energy, which they're gathering nectar for energy, but if they burn it all off, you know, what good is that? So by grouping it, once they make that journey, they can be sure to get a lot of nectar, and then they have lots of energy to get back. So if you had just one or two little patches, but they were separated really far apart, they're going to expend a lot of energy flying around to all of that favorite flower. Massing it together is the best way. And again, from a design standpoint, we as humans find that appealing. So you'll like looking at it, and your neighbors will think you're like an amazing garden designer. Oh, she's got a beautiful garden. Good for that too. So keep the variety as high as you can, you know, as high as your budget and space allow, and plant them in masses. And then the next one is be welcoming. All right. So if you plant flowers, you have supplied the food, the nectar from the flowers, right? Very important. The pollination is happening kind of by accident, right? We're feeding these bugs and they're helping us out. Cool. Imagine if you went to a town, though, that was full of restaurants that serve no beverages and no hotels to stay in. Not a fun vacation spot, is it? So you don't want to create a garden that has no drinks at the restaurant and no place to sleep at the end of the night. So this is where be welcoming comes into account. If you can, providing a shallow, clean source of water is really important. See, the picture of the butterfly on the bottom right is doing a behavior that a lot of insects do called puddling. We talk about a lot with butterfly gardens. And it's basically after a rain where there's some open sand and pebbles or rocks, they collect water from the surface. If you put out a bird feeder that's 4 inches deep, the insect could drown attempting to get water from there. So they don't just land on the surface. Most of them don't land on the surface of the water to drink. They'll rather drink from the surface of rocks. And in the case of the butterfly here, they also get some minerals from those rocks, which is an added bonus nutritionally. So leaving, either putting out a shallow source of clean water, and I did a screen grab online. There's so many options for doing a butterfly puddling station. As you can see, a lot of people take a saucer or a bird bath and fill it with pebbles and sand. And then all you need to do basically is make sure that it stays moist and wet. And then you want to keep that clean, because here in Florida, things can get pretty moldy and weird. And if there's standing water, you can have mosquito problems. So you'll want to empty it and refill it. I mean, if it's raining every day like it is now, nature is going to do that for you, right? So you're probably okay if you keep an eye on it. But that's a great source, and other insects will use that as well. The other thing you can do, and that's important that you do, is leave some open ground. And I know as humans and gardeners, we want to fill every space with a plant, and then some mulch, and then maybe a walking path, and then you go crazy with it and you fill every inch. But it's really important that we leave some bare, sandy spots. They can use it for puddling, which will mean you don't have to set up one of these stations. After a rain, there'll naturally be a puddling station. But also, like the picture on the bottom left, you see here of this miner bee, there are a lot of solitary bees that live in the ground. And these aren't, you don't have to worry about like a big scary hornet's nest you're going to fall in here. That's not what I'm talking about. These are like the miner bees here. They live alone in that little bitty hole, and they're not hurting anybody. But they need that bare ground in order to nest in. And so if you have flowers, you give them the food. If you leave bare soil or a puddling station like you see there, you give them some water, and the bare ground also will provide them a place to live. So be welcoming.
Theresa, I have a quick question.
Yes, go ahead.
So we have a sprinkler system that uses reclaimed water, and the puddling or the low, shallow sources of water, is the reclaimed water going to harm them?
That is a very good question. And I don't have a specific scientific answer because I have not seen any information about that. I know that reclaimed water in most places, while it's not safe for us to drink, they do release it obviously into the landscape And in some places, and I don't know about here in Pinellas, but in some places, they will also release reclaimed water that's treated to a certain level into lakes and ponds. So my understanding would be that it would be safe for butterflies and insects in this type of scenario, but I have also not seen any kind of scientific study or research showing us one way or the other on that. So there wouldn't be a whole lot you could do to prevent it. The only thing, I guess, if you did have a big concern, which I don't think it would be one, but you could provide a clean, one of these puddling dishes somewhere else in the landscape that doesn't receive the irrigation water and just fill it with water from the house from time to time. But this is another case where like just leaving that bare open sand and then when it rains, they're just going to get the fresh rainfall anyways, would solve that. Yeah. But I have never heard of anything harmful being noted or studied at all in that regard.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Yep. It's like everything else in science. I don't have any cause for concern now, but somebody might find a study one day that tells me differently. I can't imagine it. Most of the stuff in there's nutrients or salts. But I would hope there would be nothing else like that would harm an insect. Which leads us to the last one, right? We don't want to harm an insect. The last one would be gentle. And this goes back to the use of pesticides being one of the reasons for pollinators having a problem in the first place right now. So you want to avoid the use of toxic chemicals. And that seems like an obvious one, right? We're in a wellness class. Everyone these days is pretty aware of reducing the use of toxic chemicals everywhere, right? In our food, in our makeup, in our gardens, I mean, in our cars, wherever we try to reduce the use of those toxic chemicals. But here I feel like it's important to point out stuff that maybe you haven't thought of. For example, there's a lot of organic products on the market for garden pest control, right? If it's an insecticide, even if it's organic, it's still toxic to the insects. And so you just really want to avoid that, especially in a pollinator garden. There will be bugs that you may not enjoy for whatever reason that it might come and visit it. There will be bugs like our buddy here in the picture on the bottom right, this monarch butterfly caterpillar, who will eat your plant to the ground, the milkweed plant that you took 3 weeks to hunt down at a native nursery and then spent your good hard-earned money on. They will eat it. They will eat it to the ground, right? And you will be sad. But the worst thing you could do at that point, right, would be to apply any sort of pesticide. So just think about that. Even when one of the good examples is there's been a profusion of mosquito control companies. You guys have probably seen the signs on the road, the little garage sale type signs on the road that advertise mosquito control in your yard. And they use, the ones I've looked up anyways that I've seen the ads for, they use typically some citrus-based, very non-toxic oils that would be perfectly safe for you and your kids and your pets. And that's what they advertise, non-toxic organic products. And they're not lying, it's all true, right? But oils kill insects, oils like this. Insects breathe through their skin. And so if you coat an insect in oil, you basically smother it. That's like the real short and dirty way to describe it. So even like vegetable oil that you could cook with and eat would be completely not toxic to you, would smother that monarch caterpillar and kill it. And so just keeping in mind, it's easy to say I'm not going to put a pesticide in my pollinator garden, but you have to go larger and look at the rest of your space. And what about the lawn service? What about mosquito companies that you might hire? And think about, the importance of that. There may be a crop in your garden. There might be a plant that's really important to you. I had a neighbor, they kept a hibiscus in a pot in New York for years. They'd put it out in the summer, they baby it all winter in their house. And when they finally moved to Florida, that hibiscus was like precious to them. And they said, oh, we can finally plant it outside. It was like a kid practically to them. So they planted it outside and promptly had a horrible aphid problem. You guys know what aphids are, these tiny sesame seed-sized bugs that suck the sap out of your plants and can stress a plant out and kill it and bring disease. So they're a gardener's scourge, right? These little aphids. They got an aphid problem and they wanted to treat it. So they went out there spraying an oil, like a very non-toxic type of a spray all over. And I chatted her up and I said, hey, what are you doing? And I went and I looked at the plant, and the plant was also covered in ladybugs and ladybug larvae who were eating the aphids for her. So we had a little talk about that, you know, because she was killing the ladybugs with this non-toxic, all organic oil. So just keep in mind when you do that, if there is a plant that is that special to you, and that happens sometimes, and it's being absolutely eaten down to nothing and destroyed by an insect, it might be okay to target that, just that plant or just that small area of the landscape with a chemical pesticide, organic or synthetic, whatever. But just keep in mind that blanket applications are part of the problem here. One little spot on a plant you love, you can probably feel okay about that. So keep that in mind, because I think there's a lot of products out there that they're advertised as safe, but they're safe to us, right? Another fun fact coming up here. This is where we bring it back home to us and our wellness and why we're here. So this is from the American Psychological Association. Exposure to nature is going to give us all these things: lower stress, better mood, more empathy and cooperation, and improved attention. And I don't know about y'all, but I need these things right now. I need less stress. I need to be in a better mood. Like it says over there, what's good for the bee is good for the gardener. So anything that you do to plant a pollinator garden in your space will benefit you as much as it will the pollinators. Oh, Melissa, can I share your fact with everyone? So Melissa sent a fun fact that her family, they're going to dress up as pollinators for Halloween. I hope you share pictures, because I can't wait to see that. I might have to dress up as like different flowers, and then we can all have a Halloween party. I mean, assuming we're allowed to like go anywhere near anyone by Halloween.
My husband's going to be the flower.
Oh, your husband's going to be the flower. So you have the whole ecosystem there. I love it.
Yep. And then the dog's going to be a bee, and then my daughter's a butterfly.
I absolutely love this. That's fantastic.
I'll definitely take pictures.
You have to. Okay, so we have some questions. I wanted to also, before I answer the questions, well, the chat box does not let me advance slides then. I'll leave this up while I answer the questions. This has a lot of contact information for us. Jane, and I don't know if she'd planned to, but Jane, feel free to send them my individual email address, because this is a different one. But you can always email us at gardenhelp@pinellascounty.org. Easy for y'all to remember, because everyone ends in pinellascounty.org here. So garden help, then we can answer your questions. You can call us certain days and times that you can see there, and you can come and visit us. We are closed at lunchtime right now, and during county holidays, which is, you guys know when those are too, so that makes it easy to remember. But you can stop by with garden questions. So I just leave that up there, and then I want to look back at the questions in the chat box here. Oh heavens, where did my chat box go? Just a second, there it is. Okay. And I love that you guys have some questions here. Okay, so Tina has asked if I can explain about host plants and versus plants.
Theresa, do you mind stopping to share your screen? That way we could see you again, unless people still are writing things. But I'll send this to everybody, including Theresa's email.
Let's do that. Let's do that. Okay, so let's go back to host versus nectar plant, which is I think what you're asking about, Tina. So the nectar plants in a butterfly garden, you need both, right? You need a host plant and a nectar plant. You might have heard that. Well, multiple of those, right? So the nectar plants are a lot of what we talked about today in terms of providing nectar to the insects, food for them. And the host plants are actually the ones that they lay their eggs on. And oftentimes they'll consume the leaves that caterpillars that emerge from the eggs then consume the leaves of that host plant, like the milkweed and the monarchs. Monarchs lay their eggs on milkweed plants, and then their larvae, the little caterpillars that hatch, chew the milkweed all up and eat it. And so that's the difference, is the host plants are like the nursery where they lay their eggs and the babies grow up. And then the nectar plants are what feeds the adult butterflies. And so that's kind of the difference there. And particularly in a butterfly garden, providing both is extra important. In a pollinator garden for all, it's not something we talk about as much as we do specific to butterflies because of the butterfly life cycle and the way they work. Hope that answered your question, Tina. also have a question here. Can we use containers or pots or raised gardens for pollinator gardens? And absolutely we can do this. So any container you can think of, you want to make sure any container has good drainage. So no pots that don't have holes in it, stuff like that, because you'll flood out your plants. For sure, the roots will rot. So good drainage. The larger the better to accommodate the roots of the plants, of course. But yes, pots on a windowsill outside or in a window box, I mean, a little container garden on a patio if you live in a condo, absolutely. Everywhere we can incorporate these plants is going to be a bonus, right? And I got a couple of thank yous. Was that the last question? Okay, I thought there was another question. If I missed somebody's question, let me know. I would hate to do that. And then tell your friends, you know, if you want to get your garden certified and put a sign up so your neighbors wonder how you did it, there's a number of certifications. Oh, Doris is here. I didn't even know Doris was here. Hi, Doris. So tell your friends. That's why it's good to put it somewhere visible. I know I have a little garden, and it's really just a wildlife attracting garden, not just pollinator. I went beyond and planted some bird friendly plants. And then I put it right out on the corner. We live in a corner lot with a fire hydrant, and I planted it right out there. And you wouldn't believe the questions I get about that. People just want to know, and then can I have seeds? Can I take cuttings? And I'm like, yeah, go ahead, you know, take away. And so by doing that, you'll actually spread more habitat. So with that, are there any other questions in the group? I don't want to cut anybody off.
Yeah, I don't want to cut anyone off either, but you will get Theresa's email. So if we'll wrap it up today, and if you think of something, Theresa's amazing. So thank you again. Always so fun to have you. And thank you everyone else for joining us.
Yes,
we are going to make the video available on our wellness classes webpage. Not today, probably sometime next week. It takes a little bit. And you can certainly share this with anybody. It's a public facing site. So email the video to your friends, you know, your family members. The more pollinators, happy pollinators we have out there, the better. And the more beautiful gardens we have, the better we feel. So thank you, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you very much. I appreciate everyone's time today. Thank you. Oh, and Doris added a link.